I'm going to have to turn the mic up, aren't I? There we go. Let me start again. Professional webcasting to the end. Right, let me try that again. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to August edition and our first proper birthday of Streaming Media Advanced Forum, your monthly roundup of opinion on the latest streaming media and online audio and video news. I'm Don Robinson from Software Company Ideas and also a contributing editor to Streaming Media Advanced, to Streaming Media Advanced Forum and Streaming Media Magazine. And I am, as always, joined by my co-hosts. Well, we're missing Eric this week, but he might dive in. But I'm joined by my co-hosts, Tim Siglin and Mark East. Tim, are you out there?
I am out here, Dom. As a matter of fact, I thought you were just observing a moment of silence for net neutrality. That was
well, you know, you're jumping the gun a bit there. We'll come on to that in a little bit, Tim.
I'm sure we will. So I'm Tim Siglin, executive director of Help Me Stream organization, a not-for-profit, and also a contributing editor for Streaming Media Magazine.
Fantastic. And we also have our other erstwhile regular, Mark East. Are you out there, Mark?
I am, sir. How are you today?
Not bad. How is breakfast over in your side of the world?
Uneaten as of yet, but soon. I'm
going to start sending you wake-up calls about half an hour earlier, I think, then you can have breakfast before the show.
It's well, then I only would have gotten 3.5 hours of sleep instead of 4, so, you know, it's all good.
We'll find out. What have you been up to? Have you been gigging?
Yeah, it's starting to wind down. I think we're about to finally get a break, but we've been doing lots of stuff. Just kind of came off San Diego Comic-Con for Marvel Entertainment, and that was a lot of a lot of interesting things that we were making a TriCaster do for about 6 days straight. So it's been an interesting couple of weeks, but we're starting to consult for a couple other companies on new and exciting things, and I'll get into that later in the broadcast.
Awesome, excellent stuff. So, as always, we have some long-standing friends from around the industry joining us. A little bit of a preview, actually. Next month, we're going to be starting a new thing. We think that there should be more women joining panels and sessions on in and around the industry. So we've teamed up with a group who are going to be joining us and feeding us lots of guests who are female, which is wicked because we're all a bit bored of seeing each other's faces and we need some nicer faces to stare at while we're talking. So that's good. But for this week, Tim, can I ask you to discover who our guests are?
Certainly. First, though, I want to go back. Mark, you said you were doing something for Marvel at Comic-Con. Can you talk a little bit about that, since it obviously was a public thing? I'm just curious what you were doing, especially having watched, you know, the Avengers Infinity War and been completely bummed out at the end.
I'll go grab my wristband. I have a wristband now that says "Spared by Thanos," and it's my prized possession now. But yeah, we took over doing all of Marvel's red carpets and that sort of thing, cast chats and stuff at the end of last year. So this was our first year doing San Diego Comic-Con for them, and it is quite an experience. I've lived in San Diego for a long time. I've been in and around Comic-Con for many years, but it was the first time doing a broadcast from the show floor. And it was daunting, to say the least, but we nailed it. I think they call it Marvel Live. They've done it for a couple years now, but this was the first year that they've really kind of upped their game. And we had 8 hours a day for all 4 days of the show, with interviews and packages from all of the different panels that Marvel was involved in, and we were making a TriCaster do things it just shouldn't have done, but things turned out quite well, I think. And now
does the red carpet piece take place right there in the convention center, or at one of the 100 Hiltons that surround the building?
No, so for the red carpets, those are for the actual movie releases. So we just did Ant-Man versus Wasp, or Ant-Man and the Wasp, about a month and a half ago. Before that was Avengers Infinity War, et cetera, et cetera. So we those all happen at either the Dolby or the El Capitan or the Chinese Theater in Hollywood, or all three. Sometimes Avengers Infinity War was 2 full blocks of purple carpet, and all 3 theaters, and it was the biggest premiere that they've ever done. So it was it's been a fun time working with that group. It's a new group within Marvel Entertainment called Marvel Digital. And they're doing some new and exciting things. We're looking forward to next year. Unfortunately, they're all done for the year. So Ant-Man and the Wasp was last for 2018. Looking forward to Captain Marvel in January.
Mark, I just got to cut in with a couple of quick questions there. First of all, did you have to superimpose special effects live on air? lasers and lightning bolts and things?
There were no lasers or explosions, no, but many lower thirds and graphics and you know, that sort of thing. I kept begging them to let me do a like a shrink back animation, and they just wouldn't hear of it. It was
and of course the TriCaster has that virtual set scenario. Do they build that up and use that kind of technology, or just the basic?
Not yet. They like the backdrop is the booth and the show floor, and they like to kind of, you know, make sure that everyone knows that they're right in the middle of the action. You know, Marvel has one of the biggest booths in the show, and they've got, you know, tons and tons of traffic. It's literally impossible to move within their booth. So you know, they like that environment. We've talked about doing a virtual set sort of thing as an element of a red carpet broadcast. So hopefully they'll go for that in the future. I'd like to see what those things can do. But for the red carpets, the world premiere events, we're in a, you know, full-fledged broadcast truck. We're not using a TriCaster for those, so we'll see what happens.
Good. I'm glad to hear that, because it's not necessarily a broadcast piece of gear. So
those would be impossible. They're getting better, I will say.
They are.
The new TC1 and the IP series are fantastic, and they're robust, and they have, you know, redundant power supplies now, and they have all the things that you'd want to see in a broadcast piece of gear. But
yeah, I had that on the TC850 too, but the problem was when it takes 30 seconds to boot up through Windows, it's not an appliance. It's a computer with a bunch of stuff up to it.
That's very true. Very true.
That's a whole nother debate. So let's go to our guests. And Brett, go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background in the industry, because we were talking earlier, and it sounds like you've got a fairly varied industry background.
Hey, yeah, I'm currently with Limelight, and have been as product manager for their CDN product for about the past 3.5 years. I've really enjoyed my time at Limelight. I was a customer of Limelight's many times before joining the organization. Before Limelight, I worked at Internap as product manager for their CDN, which was a much smaller CDN, but I actually also managed their Miro product, which was a fairly big piece of the business over there, which was their IP route optimization, which really plays a lot into how video works on the internet these days. And before that, I worked in operations. So I kind of took a sidestep into product management. I got real tired of my phone ringing at 4 o'clock in the morning. And at Multicast Media and Kit Digital, I was director of North American operations for them. So we had OVP platforms that we managed there, and we did an awful lot of live streaming. At the peak, we were doing about 4,500 live events a month, most of those with equipment permanently installed in locations. So it was a pretty interesting place to be, but it was 24/7 by 365, and my phone never seemed to leave me alone. Going all the way back to the beginning of it, I did my first streaming events in the late 90s while I was working at IXL, and we had customers like WCW Wrestling at that point in time, which was a pretty strange customer to have at the time. Wrestling was so hot and popular that we would do events that would be measured in viewers of the tens of thousands, back sort of at the listeners mostly at that point in time, but really early on in the streaming space.
And was that like the Ricky Steamboat early Ric Flair era? Was that sort of that period of time?
It was Hulk Hogan, Sting.
Sting, right? Okay.
That point in time when they were going head to head, and WCW Wrestling was actually winning the ratings war against WWF and Vince McMahon. So Ted Turner had really invested pretty heavily in it, was making a pretty big dent in the market at that point in time. I was not a wrestling fan before I started doing live events with them, and I wasn't one after, but while we were doing it, boy, it was a lot of fun. Like a bunch of garbage thrown on your ringside when the bad guys show up and you're trying to protect your encoding equipment.
It is amazing how much money is spent in that by fans and how much they buy into that. So I got to ask one other quick question. You have what looks like to be the best backdrop of all of us. Is that a motorcycle behind you?
It is. It's a project bike, and it's got a couple of spots that need some paint on it. So it got rolled into my office last year, and I work alone out of the office, so it's managed to stay here for the past 6 months, and I've started really come to enjoy having it here. I had to take all the dirty laundry off of it before we started webcasting. So,
all right, we'll come back to you in a minute. Stephen Miller Jones, or otherwise known as Steve. So, Steve, you've been in the industry a long time as well, too. Bring us up to speed about all the places that you've been.
Yeah, hey Tim. Yeah, well, back in the day, I think I was probably working with Dom when we first did our first introductions to streaming. There was one famous stream from a nightclub that I didn't manage to get to because I came down with the flu, right when we were at the Ministry of Sound doing an audio broadcast back in,
nice.
when was that? 2000? No, 1998 or something like that.
October 96, dude. October. Where's your memory gone? You're getting senile now.
What's crazy, when you mentioned Ministry of Sound, when we had the first streaming media Europe in the UK, we actually had the after party at the Ministry of Sound, and I'd never seen a French guy in nothing but chaps in a vest and white BVDs, doing his thing. And I've never
to Europe.
Never seen anything like that since. What's funny is I went to a record shop in Zurich called Save the Vinyl, hoping to find some EDM loops with my business partner at the time, and they played Marvin Gaye's Sexual Healing the entire time we were in there. We were like, this is just wrong. We're in Europe looking for EDM, and we're hearing stuff from the States. So anyway, sorry, please go on.
No, that's how Europe works. So, I mean, that was really the first sort of introduction to streaming, even though I wasn't at that event. And then I think probably next, I was working in a software company in the early 2000s. And again, my good friend Dom was involved in a lot of work around mp3.com, and he had his own site, m3u8.com, started getting into sat truck, sat transmissions and encoding. And sort of, we sort of intertwined a lot over the next few years on a variety of projects. And eventually I joined Dom at Global Mix in 2008, I think, maybe 2007. As Dom says, my brain seems to have gone in terms of where dates are.
It was about 2007, I think. Yeah,
I was going to say, you weren't required to sleep in the Global Mix truck like Tim was, right?
Not often. No,
okay, I was wondering if that was like a rite of passage. With
oh shit, he's still in there. Damn, I've got to go.
That's where we left him. So then we did that a lot. As I said to my friend Brett, I actually have to make room in my brain for things, so I have to forget things like dates and Led Zeppelin lyrics these days. And then I worked at Global Mix till 2010. That was really good times. I mean, we were. I was very proud to have been part of the team that won the best live CDN, I think it was, in the European Streaming Media Awards back in 2000, and I'm going to say 9. So I think that was the right year.
That sounds about right.
Yeah, so that was really cool.
And look, it did exist.
Yeah, I even got that year right.
Hey, you got the year right on that, 2009. There we go.
Yeah. And as the door opens. And then I joined Limelight in 2010, Limelight Networks, and that was a real eye-opener for, coming from a small sort of localized CDN focused on live and audio delivery in the UK to, walking into something much more orientated around both, large-scale video delivery globally and the interconnected nature of our network and POPs, and also what goes along with the CDN. Of course, there's a lot of video, but it's also objects, right? So all of the caching and delivery and the storage workflows and all of those interconnected and shared technologies, that was huge. So joined the ops team in 2010. I ran the solutions engineering group in Europe after that through to 2012. And then I had a little vacation for a while, and then I came back and worked in product management starting in 2013. In Limelight. I worked on our web acceleration product, our content delivery product. I was very fortunate to have been introduced to Brett during that time, and Brett joined me to work on the product team and took over from me on the sort of CDN side of things, how we actually operate at scale. And I now run the product group, which spans what we call content delivery services, video delivery services, storage, security. We're getting into some edge cloud, edge services, distributed computing. And yeah, it's pretty exciting times. So I've been around. We've had some pretty exciting times recently on, some of the volumes of streaming events. This year's been, another year of sport. It seems like every year a year of sport these days. So that's been cool. And yeah, we've got a lot of exciting things coming on the product roadmap. I'm sure we'll talk about that a bit later.
Yeah, actually, let me ask a quick question. I'll throw this to both you and Brett because I'm curious. Back in the early days of Limelight and Akamai, the sort of differentiator between the two CDNs was Akamai had thousands of points of presence, sort of pushed everything out to the edge of the network. And Limelight was all about making a core network delivery much better. Has that scenario morphed over the last 15 to 20 years? I know you've been with the company, for a significant amount of time. Is the model, especially as we went to HLS, is caching and multiple pops sort of leveled the playing field in the argument of network versus edge, or is Limelight still known as sort of the core network company and better for live delivery?
So I think we're still known as a CDN where we own and operate our own network, and that gives us, in our opinion, a number of benefits, both in a live scenario, due to how we can manage the distribution of the ingest packets then across through the caches in an HTTP environment, or how we distribute a feed if it's non-HTTP. But also, the network and how we manage for cache and how we manage for depth and how we manage for scope of delivery geographically. The fact that we're in control gives us much more opportunity to deliver better performance. If you think about the hundreds of thousands of servers analogy, well, hey, I bet they're really hard to update. Right. So if you actually are in control of the environment, then you have a much better opportunity. If you think about modern DevOps approaches to how software gets rolled out and how in control you need to be, I think it gives us a much better opportunity to actually control our destiny rather than a server that's in the basement in Harvard that no one ever sees again. So, I don't know if Brett works on a lot more of that side than I do, but I think there is a fundamental difference in the architecture still. And from where I sit, I think the way that we operate the network, although we're different sized, if you look at the raw numbers, and if you look at our financial numbers, the sizes are different. I still think we offer a better opportunity on throughput, rebuffer rate, performance, and we're proving that out time and time again over the last couple of years.
And Brett, you've worked at a number of different CDNs and different architectures. What's your sort of take on what I was asking?
So I think the backbone of Limelight is a pretty interesting bit of what we do. There was in the earlier days of the internet, the last mile was perceived as really the problem to overcome. And I think most people's connectivity in the last mile is pretty good in most cases these days, and can be solved with peering. There's a lot of issues that you have to overcome in middle mile congestion, and I think the moves that other players are making in the space, where they're starting to take up their own private network links, really shows that. I think it plays into concerns that will play out over the next couple of years too, as it relates to net neutrality. Being able to control the middle of the network is going to be key to success. As far as the super pop model to many servers go, I think the likelihood that when you have 100,000 servers in the network, that any particular box has any particular piece of content that you want, except for the most popular bit, is not going to be very likely. So the fewer servers that we're able to operate with in general, I think is actually better, and we're optimizing for that all the time. You do have to bring the geography close enough to someone to not have latency be an issue, but I don't think you have to be in every server rack out there, and I don't think it's an advantage to do that. I think it's a disadvantage from management and a content distribution perspective.
So let me cut in, guys. So obviously we had one of the biggest distribution events that you have in any broadcast media last month, the World Cup. How was it for you?
I'll take a shot. As a lot of it was exciting in Europe, and then I'll hand over to Brett again. But from a perspective of the customers we work with a lot of broadcasters around Europe. I think there's probably some interesting conversation about the rights over time. But we saw a significant distribution of content across the networks. There were some events that were particularly interesting, and time of day played a part across the world. But there was a lot of concurrency, and I think from a consumer perspective, I think the choice was impressive. I think the options to consume the content were pretty varied. Involving you have to get involved in the ecosystem that the content's distributed in. So in the UK, for example, that's ITV or BBC, so you had to be involved in them. I think it was interesting around the world to look at where there were some issues, with the fairly public YouTube issues. But I think it's really interesting that all around the news there's a lot of discussion on what's the rate of subscription that people are going to be able to pay for, or people will want to pay for. How many subscriptions per household are there for subscription OTT services, or paid versus ad driven, and are the rights people are buying going to actually be able to be recoverable based on ad or subscription based models? So I think it was a really interesting event from the perspective of how much content is being distributed OTT. I don't think the challenges were necessarily network based. I think the multi-format issues, there was some UHD going on, which was interesting. And I think it's about being well prepared for those events that makes them go well. I think the interesting thing as a consumer is going to be the fragmentation of availability due to the rights fragmentation itself and the different players coming into the OTT market.
Did you guys publish any concurrency stats? Because there was some discussion threads that I saw on social. Did you guys publish any figures about concurrency, number of customers, sort of volumetrics, and so on? Have you guys got any of those to hand?
No, we didn't publish those, and it's the easiest thing for us really is to go and look at. We work with pretty large broadcasters in geographies around the world, and I'd sort of refer to those numbers. We're a significant global CDN in the mix, so we carry the traffic. It's difficult for us to turn around and say we carried this much for this person, as it's not typically they don't want to have a view of a small part of their traffic, or half or 3/4 or whatever the number is that we might be carrying for that broadcaster. So it's more interesting for us to look at the total engagement of the event overall. And if there are, say, 5 CDNs involved in a massive event and 4 of them have a problem, the last one's going to have a problem too. So the individual numbers are interesting from our perspective. I don't think it makes a great story for us to come out and say we did X, because it's not representative of the event itself.
I take it though the network wasn't quaking on its beat. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, I was just going to, how about this statistic of the rights holding broadcasters that you did carry traffic for? How many of them have a multi-CDN strategy, and how many of them are exclusively on Limelight? You happen to know?
And if he knows, can he talk about it?
Exactly, yeah. I'm certainly not asking you to name names, but just in terms of a percentage, how popular is that among large, content holders, broadcasters?
Multi-CDN delivery is pretty much du jour, what everyone does. That's both from a risk perspective and from a coverage of distribution in multiple countries point of view. We have a network of, say, I think we're currently at like 83 or 85 points of presence, or locations in our points of presence. We don't cover every country. So, if you're trying to get into Africa, for example, for the distribution of those, we don't have a huge African footprint. So if you're trying to get your stream to Africa, you'd have used multi-CDN. It's pretty common to see it across the major broadcasters that they have more than one.
But you'd say it's more due to the desire for a global footprint as opposed to a redundancy scenario?
I'd say both play a significant part, in the decision making. It's, in my opinion, pretty unlikely that you'd come across a major broadcaster who is using a single global CDN to support their distribution.
Copy that. Thanks.
Brett, were you trying to cut in there?
I was. I keep trying to talk over people. I should stop doing that.
No, I think your voice activation on your mic's taking a couple of seconds to kick in each time. But
it's not only the delivery strategy where you're doing multi-CDN to have a primary and a backup, or to spread the traffic out. There's also a huge play on the contract negotiation side, where a provider plays CDNs against each other. I think the really interesting change in that I've seen over the past couple of years, as from the multi-CDN from the best delivery quality that they can get, is that the providers that are providing the signal out, the player out to the end users, have great visibility now into the quality of the stream that the end user is seeing, and they make very active decisions on which CDN they're going to use based on the quality that's being delivered out there. Maybe not minute to minute in a scenario, but definitely over the long term, they're looking at, on this provider, I'm getting better quality on this CDN, so I'm going to use that CDN for that delivery. And they've got visibility at this level that really people have never had before into what the performance looks like of an individual end user sitting and watching a stream.
So was the problem in Australia with Optus because of the fact that they didn't have redundancy? They assumed because they were doing it primarily as mobile delivery through EMBMS or whatever solution they were using. Was that a redundancy problem, or do any of us have any insight into what that issue was there?
Stunned silence. I don't think I have a lot of insight into if it was a redundancy problem or not. I don't know that we're going to find out easily the root. Get our hands on the RCA for what actually happened. It was certainly interesting that it was pretty visible, and so it does point towards there being issues of redundancy somewhere. When we planned for, say, the last Olympics, we planned for the UK Olympics, and to again bring it to the UK for a second, the amount of time it took, not only to be sure for the major broadcasters who were involved in that connection to origin, and the way in which we're doing cache depth meant that we were not overwhelming the origin on cache fill, and how we deal with like live event traffic means that we don't take the thundering herd of each request for the same thing that you haven't already got and send it all back. Not only did we spend so much time on that type of thing, but how much time we spent working with the carriers and transit providers and the infrastructure providers of the country to ensure that there was not a redundancy problem was impressive. And it sort of smells a bit like from that one that there was just something not quite right with the planning. That's what it looks like on the outside. I don't know much more than that.
Yeah, nor do I. I just wondered if it was a bit of bravado to say our network can handle it, because I think they tested on English Premier League last year and seemed to have relatively decent success. But obviously the World Cup has a much higher number of potential viewers across the country for them.
I think it's only rumor, but I'd heard it was similar to some of the fault issues that were going on with, was it NHL or something last year with sign on for DRM stuff? But that's rumor, as far as I can find.
It is interesting, isn't it? If you sort of pick that point up and then look across the gamut, right? There's the video. Everyone's like, it's the video. Every time you go watch a video, you have to get into a portal. You have to do your authentication. You have to do your DRM request. You have to get your license. There's a whole gamut of HTTP traffic going on and application layer traffic going on and security pieces in place that maybe get overlooked in the planning. Can I get enough requests per second on the video is one thing. Is an authentication server going to fall over because everyone forgot about it, or it wasn't incorporated in the scope well enough? Whatever, InfoSec overlooked a ticket. There's so much depth of complexity in the distribution of video into the apps and the app environment, as much as in the encoding, distribution, the production. What protocol are we going to use? What format are we going to get in? Did we get to every device with the right formats? So there's a whole gamut of stuff as well, which is pretty interesting around. Can you be successful in your event? It's not just the video, right? And so all the web acceleration pieces, all the security pieces. Is your WAF in the way of your origin going to be able to stand up to the request per second as much as the CDN can, or your distribution partner can? So I think
Dom,
gone up.
Yeah, Dom, I think when we had Christopher Levy on, we were talking about a similar failure, and the conversation got around to, is it a failure on the video side, video delivery side, or is it a failure on the, DRM/authentication side? And I think the general consensus at that point was that, 9 times out of 10, when you have a massive, very visible failure like that, it tends to be, due to the fact that everyone paid a whole lot of attention to the video delivery piece and not a whole lot of attention to, you know, bulletproofing the licensed server piece or that sort of thing. Would you agree, Steve, Brett?
I think it's easy to have a weak spot that you miss in any sort of delivery like that. Yeah, I've seen player embed codes that were used before that loaded a player multiple times and would DDoS the end user because we're actually running the video stream layered multiple times in there. I've seen DRM issues. Certainly there have been CDN scale issues. I've seen issues with not enough redundancy at the encoding side of it, where the streams are starting out. You know, we should have had a satellite truck out there or something to help it along. It is usually the spot that didn't get looked at or thought about, and people assumed would be okay. That will go poorly in a live event, and unfortunately, and often it's very difficult to get the attention across all of those spots that you should have had when it goes across multiple vendors.
Yeah, I find that the points of failure that even the least experienced content holders are paying attention to tend to now include the first mile, include the production and the encoding and that sort of thing, and those are all bulletproofed and made redundant. But we're still at the point where if you have a very large event that is, you know, where there is a significant, you know, a pay-per-view model or a DRM piece in place or you know, something like that, there's occasionally little attention paid to that component, and so that's where the failure can arise.
Sorry, go ahead, Dom.
I was going to say, I think we also struggle from my life. Yeah, we also struggle with the fact that at the moment the broadcasters are so probably threatened. Their traditional models are quite threatened that even the slightest issue on streaming gets a lot of fanfare still. Where I'm not quite sure that if you get I know that there were a number of problems with the traditional broadcast over here. People were switching between broadcast channels, BBC One, ITV, and so on, because they were having problems with one or the other. And I didn't quite see the same news furore about those as you do when one streaming provider in Australia has a problem. Suddenly it's, oh, streaming will never work. Live streaming's never going to take off. It's all crap. Everyone's clapping before they've seen the goals and all this sort of stuff. And I think that that's actually, to an extent, change resistance from the traditional industry as much as possible. I think.
Well, and you notice it was a great PR move for the traditional broadcaster in Australia to promote that, because not only did they promote that it didn't work one day and put the mobile provider on the hook to get it fixed, when it didn't work 2 days later, and all of a sudden the solution was we're going to hand it back to the traditional broadcaster. That became essentially preaching to the choir of broadcasters who, as you say, are challenged on this. I was going to add one other thing. It's interesting to me. I wrote an article or a column for Streaming Media talking about how first world problems and third world problems when big events are hosted. And you remember, Dom, because you've got ties to Brazil, that when Brazil, after the London Olympics, they were going to do the World Cup and the Summer Olympics. And there was this huge outcry that the venues weren't going to be ready on time. The venues were not only ready, they were able to be used to host events in a space of 2 years. Same thing in Russia, obviously, with the World Cup. And ultimately what happened in South Africa, if we go back to, I think, 2010, there, the venues were completely ready. The infrastructure capability for dense wave division multiplexing and other things to do broadcast out of there were brought in on a temporary basis, used for that event, and then yanked right back out of Africa. And it's interesting to hear Steve mention that there's still issues about getting into Africa when, in terms of ISP providers and like that. So part of what I'm looking at that I find fascinating is we talk about this infrastructure model. And in the first world, we sort of point fingers at quote unquote third world countries for not having their act together. But it's very clear in Australia that in a first world environment, we didn't have the infrastructure together as an industry or they as a single provider. So I think it's fascinating to me that the premise of infrastructure matters when it comes to big events is as much about this kind of thing as it is about the venues themselves.
So, guys, I've got a chip in for you. What do you like? Next story on my pile here is that is just to pick up on Amazon paying about 80 million UK pounds for Premier League rights online and so on. I mean, obviously, the big guys are starting to commit quite seriously to taking live sports online and make that industry grow and so on. Are we there yet? Have we got a bit more roller coaster in terms of expectation setting? Do you think on the in terms of user experience, or you know, what's your general feeling at the moment with live sports getting online?
So I have a few opinions. I think there are a number of questions hiding in there. So one, sports going online, I think, is an obvious OTT play because of the range of interests that there are in the consumer base. In theory, it offers a much cheaper access to delivery than traditional satellite or buying time on a channel on satellite or broadcast. And I think that still holds true. I think what's interesting in a different way about what's happening in the rights market, if you look at Amazon and you drill into their business model, what's really happening for them in particular is the issue with how much it costs them to acquire a new Prime customer. And yeah, there you go. There's the quote in the middle of the screen there, right? If you think about their average time to convert someone to Prime and the average revenue they earn from Prime before that user does anything, it gets them an awful lot of benefit to convert that user to a Prime user to watch one game. So I think there's some intertwining of economic interest in their particular case. And I think we have to look carefully at some of the other operators who buy rights for OTT distribution, who are looking at their subscription models and what else comes with it in order to understand the economics. I then think that there's a third question you're asking, I think, which is about, are we ready for this? So let's just take a step back. The big events are interesting because there are lots of people watching the same thing. So, that puts us pressure. If we think about our systems, it's higher requests per second for the same content, for the same objects, so it's a scale problem, right? What's happening every single day, there's not a big event. However, those same people are all watching things online, just not quite at the same time as each other. They're all consuming content, Amazon, Netflix, iPlayer, you name any, as Tim was saying, sort of first world country where we've got a distribution of OTT services, people are watching them all the time. The scale is already in place and being distributed and used all the time. It's just concentrated in a live event. So I don't think it's surprising that the OTT rights are being fragmented, and I do believe people will be watching them online. I don't think that's in general a particular problem. I think the economics of it are pretty fascinating, and I think the challenge is going to be to look at, as a consumer, how much am I willing to pay and how many platforms do I want? If they're ad funded, I think there's still challenges with the quality versus how much do you get paid for the old statement. Do I get any more money for an SD ad, or do I get any do I get any more money for an HD ad than I do for an SD ad? And the answer is no. So the ad model has some challenges with quality and cost. So I think the economics as a consumer are going to be interesting. So I think there are a lot of things hiding in the question of, is sports right to go online? I think fundamentally, yes. I think the internet can cope with it. Large single events are interesting, challenging, but in general terms, I don't see why not.
So there's an interesting one of the other articles, which I'll stick up in a minute when I stop yattering. But one of the other interesting comments that's been circulated is that obviously in the streaming environment and in the online world, they can push technical boundaries that much faster. So there was a couple of streaming companies that had installed a number of 8K cameras around for streaming the World Cup. And that was pretty unique to being able to stream 8K to any platform, and it can only be done online. So I think that the innovation edge is probably starting to drift. I doubt we're going to see that type of expense in broadcast infrastructure probably until it's proven on streaming these days, which is a bit of a turning of the tables from how things were a few years ago, at least. I think people are willing to experiment more.
I think maybe online. I mean, your device in my hand has got a really high level of luminosity. The lumens are really high, right? So it can handle the some of the resolution. If you look at the buying cycle of TVs, I think that's really what you're competing with, because some of the research that we do, we publish papers like about the state of online video and that kind of thing. And one of them, we did a lot of research into the buying cycle and where do people watch things. The TV, that device, the bigger device in a lean back environment is still a focal point for consuming the content. So I think for like things like 8K and the broadcaster environment, you're still tied into a consumer cycle of when am I going to buy a new TV? So I think that's still prevalent versus how quickly I replace the phone in my pocket, which seems to have a much shorter life cycle.
I just want to add one thing to that before Mark goes on to the next topic. I had a conversation with a SMPTE fellow 4.5 years ago. We were talking about 4K streaming versus 4K broadcast. And he almost to the month said, gave me the projection as to when he thought 4K broadcast would happen. And he said very clearly, we're going to try it out in streaming first. So Dom, to your point, I think that's exactly what's happening. It's much easier to play around with a whole bunch of variable bandwidths and figure out where the optimum is so that you can then apply that to the spectrum of over-the-air broadcast or cable frequencies. So yeah, I think we are now both the test bed and the canary in the coal mine to figure out what makes sense for the next format.
I think that could be said of pretty much any large rights holding broadcaster for any of these large properties, the Olympics or the World Cup. The live streaming is the test bed for everything from 8K to HDR to 10-bit to whatever. And I think that's relatively recent, and I think it's probably here to stay for a little bit. What are the thoughts on that from the CDN side?
So I think that the end-to-end nature of broadcast, and that you have to upgrade when you're doing broadcasting, you have to upgrade every step of the way. It's fairly cost prohibitive most of the time. It's really pretty cheap for them to experiment around on the IP side of it and stream it over the internet. The devices on the end are fairly easy to adapt to the different bit rates out there, and consumers are adding in those things fairly quickly. I didn't think I'd be one of those guys that would upgrade to a 4K TV so quickly, but I did, and 8K is coming soon, I'm sure, here in my living room, even though I don't really care about the quality of the picture myself. I know a lot of people do. It's not, I've never had that golden eye for looking at a picture. I just like the content coming across. I think the interesting thing from a scale perspective is that every time we have one of these large events, the players that deliver it get better. We started planning for World Cup many months ago, and we made a lot of improvements that were some of them fairly innovative tuning of our systems in order to handle that World Cup traffic coming through. Now, the event's over. All of the tuning work that we've done to improve our systems is in place from here going forward. So every time we look and achieve a new peak in traffic or a live event or something like that, and we have success there, the foundation that we built is where we're growing on for the next step there. So I think the industry is going to do a pretty good job scaling to meet the needs as broadcasters and viewers get the content out there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting part of this equation. I mean, it's certainly costly to upgrade the broadcast chain to support something like 4K, but it's even costlier and introduces more of a delay to wait for the installed base to be there so that people can actually watch 4K. Like, I've had a laptop with a 4K screen for 3 years now, and though I hesitate to admit this, I don't have a 4K television yet. So if I wanted to watch this content, I would have to watch it on my laptop, but I can now. And there are many, excellent 4K compatible players out there, and it's a lot easier to develop a player than it is to, wait for people to have 4K in their living room in a lean back experience. So, yeah, I think that's more of part of the equation than updating the broadcast chain, if you will.
But we still have to solve the latency issue in streaming. And I think that's the thing that why I see us as the test bed we can do 4K all day long, but if it's 4K at a 30-second delay versus television, for live events, we're not competing with television. We're still at this bed.
I agree, and I posted a couple articles to the Flipboard regarding ultra low latency streaming. We're actually consulting for 2 different companies right now that have very interesting concepts that in part mirror the HQ Trivia model, where they're developing apps, vertical video apps that have various applications, but they all rely on very high numbers of flash traffic tuning in for a 20-minute period to do something. I can't talk about what they're doing at this point, but
no, it's not peer-to-peer. It's something else other than peer-to-peer.
Yeah. So it's very much like HQ Trivia leverages a couple different CDNs to do what they need to do. Since we have the brain trust from Limelight here, I was wondering what is the state of the art for ultra low latency at this point. I know Wow's has been in the press a lot for their newish solution. I've heard just anecdotally, I've heard lots of people talking about their solution as being the be-all end-all answer at this point, but it seems to me that it's not really it doesn't really enable a huge scale. So Brett, Steve, what does Limelight offer, and is it the state of the art, and where are we going from here?
So it's interesting. We've taken, as an industry, we've really taken some pretty significant steps backwards in low latency streaming in recent years. When I started using Limelight as a CDN back when I was doing live event stuff at Multicast Media, we were doing, I usually wouldn't talk about customers, but it's customers from a long time ago in a different company, so I guess I can. We were doing live streaming of Sotheby's auctions, art auctions, and we actually had one time the buyer of a Rothko painting. It went for like $90 million. He was actually watching the live stream, bidding on the painting of it. And the latency at that point was super important. And we were at I think about 2.5, 3 seconds on average on the Limelight network at that point in time, which was pretty awesome. I think Akamai, we were about 10 or 12. And I can't remember where level 3 was at that point in time. But so we were using Limelight for live streaming at that point in time. When you get into a chunk streaming service, your time goes way up that you're doing, as everybody here knows, and it just doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. We've got a new platform that we haven't launched yet. We're getting ready to. It's coming out at IBC, and I'm actually going to bump it over to Steve because I'm not sure which pieces of it I should talk about and which pieces I shouldn't. So I'll let him talk for a minute, and then I'll take from his lead and fill in there. But we are getting ready to get ourselves back in that spot where we have the lowest latency live solution at scale. I think there's a lot of solutions out there right now that really aren't at scale. They're good for small scale events, but we're going to do something that's really good for live at scale. And I'll let SMJ talk a little bit about that, if you don't mind, SMJ, to bail me out so I don't talk about things I shouldn't.
Just carry on. Our aim from a sort of product management perspective, if I sort of start there, Brett and I both work in product management. The aim, we started talking about this a long time ago. The aim was that there must be a way to enable us to scale easily that doesn't then require a fully customizable plugin. It can't be just peer-to-peer where we've got no control, and we surely must have some format available to us that can actually be natively adopted out in the consumer side of things that we can use to deliver a low latency streaming solution. So we started a long time ago looking at the prospect of WebSockets, and we turned to looking at WebRTC as it became more natively supported. And I think there was a real turning point towards that kind of protocol and format when Apple announced a year and whatever ago that they were going to natively support the format as well. So we've been working on an at-scale solution to deliver sub-second latency video. And we've been working with a number of players in the gaming and sports industries to identify what the key requirements are for that kind of streaming. So, in a sort of gaming or gambling environment, is it a tiny screen? Is there high resolution? What's the effect of a packet loss? What's the effect of on the user? What is the use case they're catering for? So there are a number of different requirements coming into it that drive us down the solution set that are specific to the industries that are really crying out for it. It's interesting to look at sports, esports, as a consumer environment and lean back leisure watching versus an engagement from a betting standpoint, for example. There are quite different fundamental requirements going on. So we've approached it to understand that and try and come out with something that's going to be natively supported, can be. It'll have the ability to be used in plugins for SDKs and built into apps, so you get a rich environment. And we've been looking at the feature set so that there's the possibility for ABR, there's the possibility for shared data objects to be used, so that you can get a truly interactive environment going on. So we're really excited about what we're doing. We've been at NAB and a number of conferences around the world this year demoing our proof of concept platform, and we've been able to get under a second globally from ingest in one location, and then we show on a number of screens latency from local playout, international playout, and far away international playout, and we've been able to get under a second, and it's a UDP format. So what's then interesting about low latency then is the challenge that you have on what happens when there is some packet loss along the way. In a UDP environment, you're not going to request the packet again, so there's a difference in how the stream behaves. If you then sort of look back up the stack and say, well, actually, I want like 2-second delay. We've also done a lot of work in our sort of packaging product. We have a product called MMD Live, which is orientated around Dash, HLS, chunked HTTP streaming. And we've done a lot of work on ensuring that both manifests and tiny chunks can be reasonably accelerated and delivered well, so you can get down to a couple of seconds on those formats. And then what's interesting is, of course, you end up with drift on the devices because of the error correction, but you get a slightly, you don't end up with the jittery frames if you lose packets. So they're very different experiences for the consumer. So it's going to be really interesting to see where the use cases drive down the low latency or sub-second latency. But we're really excited on what we're going to call Limelight real-time streaming coming out at IBC. We're going to have all sorts of demos. Things like HQ Trivia that you mentioned, using the shared data objects to do voting. It's really, really cool how in sync you can be across a number of different devices. And one of our core sort of tenets on the whole thing is to give our customers who want to distribute at that scale a simple ingest and scaled output. Right, it doesn't need to be difficult. It should be like using a CDN. It should be amazing. So we're really, really excited about it. I think we've got some good options for low latency, sub 5 seconds, sub 2 second, and we're going to have a great sub-second latency option too.
So
Can I
Fantastic.
sorry, was that a product announcement on SMAth? Oh, okay.
it's a product tease on SMAth, I think, is what Steve's doing. So I had a quick question.
We're going to be launching our product officially at IBC in Amsterdam.
Good. Well,
we'll be there personally on the stand. It's going to be great.
We'll be there to all wave our hands and see how quickly it responds. So a quick question for you. The sub 1 second, you mentioned both chunking and non.
Not with chunking. You can't do. I haven't seen chunking under RAT 2. It just doesn't work.
Right. Okay, good. I just wanted to clarify that. Because I had written that white paper for Wowza on latency last year, and we had to very clearly define that anything under sub 1 second was not chunks. So
no,
right. So it's WebRTC based, yeah.
Yeah.
So what are the limitations to scale with that platform? Can you talk about that at this point?
I mean, the limitations to scale are going to be in how we designed and deployed our layer of repeating throughout the network. So at a certain point, it's just like a CDN. It's going to be a scale game on how many servers you add. But then let's be smart about how we think about servers. In the old days of Flash, you'd just throw hardware at it. That's not a great scale argument in terms of economics or smarts in terms of how we deal with technology. So we're going to be operating in a pretty modern environment with scaling involved. And then going to have streams in and distribute them through the network. As we are a private network, we get to control our backbone. So we think it's going to be pretty exciting.
Do you think everyone's going to switch to that? I mean, why would anyone stream with more latency if they can stream universally at scale with low latency? Do you think it's an inevitability that they'll all move to the low latency solution over time?
I think you have to look at the use case. Do you need synchronized because you can't tell the difference in half a second? Do you need synchronicity, and do you need it to be as close to real as possible? And does that give you a value-based differentiator as a broadcaster? Will people pay for it? Is going to be the question. So there are certainly now some use cases where the answer to that question is yes. There are other use cases where you've already built a delay in, but you because it's no swearing on TV, but you've got betting. You've got an interactive TV show like, I don't know, American Idol, which has some audience interaction, and you're doing that online. You're going to want the latency to be really low because of the interaction. You're then going to have some things which are live broadcast, but there's no interaction. And does it matter if there's a 5-second, 10-second, 20-second delay? And the answer is going to be no. If you're broadcasting, you've only got a once a week release of a program. If there's no interaction, does it matter? So I think it'll be use case based. Sorry.
But I think to Dom's point, the question is, if all things being equal, pricing, etc., if as we talked about before, where we continue to build the infrastructure, tweak the infrastructure, let's say you get it to this point, is the issue going to be only one of price, or is it going to be one of not enough infrastructure to handle low latency at scale for everybody who's doing live webcasts?
So all things aren't going to be equal in it. If you look at how so many folks have been able to deploy multi-CDN strategies, it's really based around the fact that a vast majority of video is HTTP chunks now, and HTTP networks all behave pretty much the same way, and it's very easy to connect one to another as an origin for it, so you're not overwhelming origins and that type of thing.
Sure.
Whereas the solution that we're putting in place is our solution, so there wouldn't be a match and a competitor to be able to share that traffic in that fashion.
I'm just to the earlier point. I'm interested to know, how are we not just going backwards here? How are we not just going back to a, owned and operated network, FMS RTMP sort of model where yes, you can have low latency because you're not leveraging vast, numbers of HTTP servers to serve up your video chunks. I mean, isn't it just what we were doing, 6, 7, 8 years ago?
Yeah, but we're calling it WebRTC now instead of.
Well, that's time to invest in Adobe, guys.
Well, I think the question is actually, I would ask the question a different way. Right? I would look at it and say, what are the audience demanding, and what are the people producing the content demanding that is available for them to deliver, and can we provide a solution for that? And so what we've been looking at is what are we being asked to do, how are we being asked to behave for end users, and can we provide a solution for that? So I appreciate that there's an interesting technological twist on, is it just going backwards? But I don't really think that the way in which one is building and deploying a solution stack today is the same as how one would approach deploying FMS in a scaled environment back in 2010. So it might look like that if you just think about it from the format side and how does the client connect and where's the ingest. But I think if you think about managing a service at scale, I think it's vastly different.
Steve, you mentioned hardware. Sorry, Brett, I didn't mean to cut you off, but let me just ask a quick question. You mentioned hardware. The old days, we throw hardware at things. Does virtualization actually cause additional latency, or does the idea of virtualization lower the latency overall? And that may be a question for Brett from a technical standpoint. But
it's a little bit loaded. I think in a lot of cases, virtualization, that extra layer of virtualization, you just can't squeeze everything that you want to squeeze out of a piece of software when it's in place. So there's a lot of things that make sense virtualized, but there's a lot of delivery at scale things. We're getting your software onto bare metal just makes more sense than a virtualized service does. I mean, being able to pick up and move VMs around from deployment, replication, and quality of service standpoint is certainly really, really nice operationally. But there are just a lot of things where getting down to the bare metal is the right solution. We've got a partner that's put some equipment on our network, guys that I'm friends with actually from years ago, Packet, and they're doing a whole deployment of just bare metal at the edge. Is there a cloud solution that they're looking at for customers that really understand really specifically what they want to do and how they want to execute it, and they don't want anybody in the middle mucking about with their technology. So they're just spinning up bare metal servers. They do it very fast, like you'd get a cloud service, but you're actually getting a box with nothing on it except for the hardware to start off with, which is pretty interesting that there's a demand for that at the edge of the network, sort of outside of the streaming space.
Cool. So Tim, you mentioned we're actually slightly overrunning, but we've got a couple of little bits and pieces to fit in. We usually try to do a bit of a sexy kit roundup right at the end of the session. So Tim, you mentioned you've got some new toys or some old toys. What have you got this week?
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, I'm glad that Brett said that about bare metal at the edge. So I'm going to use these and explain them based on the size of phones. So this is an iPhone 7 Plus. This is actually the computer that fits within that size. This is based on the Rockchip 3399. So it's a 6-core with a GPU that has multiple shader options. And then the same thing, the mini version of that, which fits in the same size as an iPhone SE. And as a matter of fact, we're actually playing with these to deploy to the edge for a project that I'm working on. And precisely for the fact that you can't, one of them just dropped. Precisely for the fact that you can't necessarily in a virtualized model do some of the things that you can do on bare metal. So these are typically $100 roughly is what. Now the problem for us in the States, because of our lovely president's tariffs, is we're having difficulty getting these out of China at the moment. So I may end up making a trip to China just to pick a couple up.
Well, you might have to do that now you've dropped one on the floor at least. Excellent. So quick roundup question. Who's going to IBC? Brett, are you at IBC?
I think I'm not going this year.
You're not going? Oh.
He's got to work on the motorcycle.
I'm just getting back to learning to use my leg again after a motorcycle injury. So I think IBC is just a little bit too ambitious for me this year.
Oh,
no trekking around the canals this year. Tim, are you going to be there?
Yeah, plan to be.
Excellent, brilliant. Mark, hey, are you coming over?
Oh, you'd know. I'm not coming this year, unfortunately. Yeah. Sorry. Next year for sure.
Cool. And Steve, are you there?
Yeah, we're going to be there. I'm going to be there personally. I'm going to try and help you avoid the canals this time.
You had to mention it.
Oh, mate, I've known you for that long. Of course I did.
I'm taking the armbands this year. Don't worry.
Good plan. And no, we're going to have, as Limelight, we're going to have a pretty exciting time. So no, we're really psyched to be there. It's going to be really good.
Okay, cool. And I know that Eric's going to be there this year, so I am sure that we will be at the beach. Those of you who'd like to join the SMAF crew will be at the beach about 4 or 5 o'clock on the Friday, as always, and expect not to do much after that. So if the -IF forum is on Friday, then guys, you need to move that because we're doing the SMAF meeting at 4 or 5 o'clock on the beach. So, guys, thank you so much for joining us, Brett. We'll see you before too long. Excellent. Tim, as always, we'll see you next month. And
I just plugged it in, checked out, and it works fine.
Of course, Tim, Mark, Eric, and myself will be joined by the members of the new group at the next SMAF. And we'll tell you more about that over the month. So stay tuned to our news feeds and so on and so forth. Mark, thank you very much. Enjoy the weather over there, but I have to say, just for once, we've got some of your weather here.
Yeah, it seems to be lovely almost globally at this point. So yeah, enjoy that and enjoy IBC.
48 degrees in Spain today, I understand. So yeah, anyway.
Oh, never mind.
And Steve, we should be going out and enjoying the sunshine. I shall see you with my visitor from overseas, who we were at school with as well. I shall see you tomorrow night.
Exciting.
For some more obviously professional conversations and so on.
Absolutely.
And then if my buttons all work, I should be able to give us a play out, Sting. We'll see you all next time.